asking what this means now for your family. Will you no longer take your children back? The discovery. The morning of October 3rd began like any other within the walls of Buckingham Palace. Staff moved through corridors with practiced efficiency, their footsteps echoing against marble floors that have witnessed 3 centuries of British history. Yet beneath the grandeur, beneath the statues where monarchs have entertained presidents and prime ministers, something long forgotten was about to surface. James Whitmore had worked in palace maintenance for 17 years. His role rarely attracted attention, which suited him perfectly. On this particular Tuesday, he descended into the subterranean levels with a work order that seemed routine: investigate persistent moisture readings in the northwest basement quadrant. The palace sits atop layers of history, its foundations reaching deep into London's clay, and water intrusion was nothing unusual for a building constructed in 1703. The basement stretched before him like a labyrinth. Narrow passages connected storage rooms filled with furniture from forgotten eras, Christmas decorations from decades past, and boxes of correspondence that historians might one day examine. The air hung heavy with the scent of old stone and preserved wood. Whitmore's torch cut through the darkness, illuminating walls that had stood since the reign of Queen Anne. He found the moisture source quickly enough. Water had seeped through a crack in the exterior wall, creating a dark stain that spread across the stones. But as he examined the damage more closely, something caught his eye. The wall itself seemed wrong. The stones didn't align with the surrounding masonry. He pressed his hand against the damp surface and felt it give slightly. What happened next would send shock waves through the palace and eventually far beyond its walls. The section of wall, weakened by water damage over many years, crumbled beneath his touch. Behind it lay not a solid foundation but empty space. A room, a hidden chamber that architectural records never acknowledged. Whitmore called his supervisor immediately. Within 2 hours, palace security had cordoned off the entire basement level. By afternoon, senior members of the royal household had arrived, their faces grave as they peered into the darkness beyond the collapsed wall. What they saw defied immediate explanation. The chamber measured approximately 6 mx 4m. Unlike the rough stone passages of the basement proper, this space had been deliberately finished. The walls bore traces of Victorian-era plaster, now crumbling with age, but it was the contents that commanded attention. Against one wall stood a series of wooden filing cabinets, their surfaces covered in decades of dust. A desk sat in the corner, paper still arranged across its surface, as if someone had simply stood up and walked away. Lady Sarah Petton, the deputy master of the household, stood at the threshold and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. She had served the crown for 23 years, had walked every documented corridor of the palace, and had never seen reference to this space in any architectural survey or historical record. The decision to enter came swiftly. 2 security officers, accompanied by a palace archivist, stepped carefully into the sealed room. Their movements disturbed air that had remained still for an unknown period. The dust they kicked up danced in the beam of their torches like ghosts, reluctant to be disturbed. The filing cabinets contained documents, hundreds of them, thousands perhaps. The papers were organized with meticulous care, each file labeled in precise handwriting that spoke of another era. Names, dates, locations. As the archivist began to carefully examine the contents, her hands began to tremble. These were not ordinary palace records. They were personal files, detailed dossiers that documented the private lives of individuals connected to the royal household throughout the Victorian and Edwardian periods. Servants, staff members, even minor members of the aristocracy who had moved through palace circles. The level of detail was extraordinary. Financial information, family connections, personal habits, secrets. But the files represented only part of what the chamber contained. On the desk lay a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with the same careful handwriting that labeled the cabinets. The archivist opened it with trembling hands. The first entry was dated May 1887, the year of Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. The journal revealed itself as a log, a record of surveillance activities conducted within the palace itself. Someone had been watching, recording, documenting the movements and conversations of people who believed themselves safe within the crown's protection. As word spread through the upper levels of the palace, the initial shock gave way to urgent questions. Who had created this hidden archive? On whose authority had this surveillance been conducted? And perhaps most disturbing of all, how many people in positions of power had known about it? The sun set over London that evening, casting long shadows across the palace gardens. Inside, in a secure room far from public areas, senior advisors gathered around the documents that had emerged from the basement. The pile grew as archivists carefully transported more files from the hidden chamber. Each new folder added weight to a realization that was becoming impossible to ignore. The palace, that symbol of tradition and stability, had harbored a secret department, an invisible apparatus dedicated to gathering information on anyone who might pose a risk or embarrassment. Complication to the crown. The implications stretched backward through time and forward into the present. If such a department had existed, if these files represented its work, then questions of privacy, trust, and power demanded answers. Lady Sarah made a phone call as midnight approached. The conversation was brief and its contents classified, but the wheels were now in motion. The discovery could not be contained within basement walls. It would require investigation, explanation, and almost certainly revelation. The investigation begins. Dawn broke over a palace transformed by knowledge. The discovery had remained secret for less than 24 hours, contained within a circle of fewer than 30 people. Yet already the weight of what lay beneath their feet had altered the atmosphere of the building. Staff moved with new awareness, sensing without understanding that something fundamental had shifted. Detective Chief Inspector Rebecca Thornton arrived through a side entrance at 7:00 that morning. Her Metropolitan Police career had included investigations into financial fraud, organized crime, and historical abuse cases, but nothing had prepared her for this summons. The briefing she received in a wood-paneled office took 40 minutes. When it concluded, she sat in silence for a long moment before speaking. "We need to establish provenance," she said finally. "Who created these files, when and under what authority? Until we understand the context, we cannot assess what we're actually dealing with." A team assembled quickly. Historians from the Royal Archives, document specialists, a forensic accountant, 2 additional detectives. They worked under conditions of absolute secrecy, knowing that premature disclosure could trigger consequences none could fully predict. The hidden chamber became a crime scene in all but name, not because a specific crime had been identified, but because the methodology of criminal investigation offered the most rigorous framework for understanding what they had found. Every document was photographed in situ before removal. The arrangement of furniture was measured and recorded. Even the dust patterns were documented. Dr. Eleanor Chen, the lead archivist, began the painstaking work of creating an inventory. The filing system revealed itself as sophisticated and comprehensive. Files were organized first by year, then by category. The categories themselves told a story: household staff, visiting dignitaries, political figures, family connections, and one marked simply as special attention. The first file she examined in detail dated from 1886. They documented members of the palace household staff with a level of specificity that felt invasive even across the gulf of nearly 140 years. A footman's gambling debts, a housemaid's illegitimate child, a junior secretary's letters to a political radical. Each file contained not just information, but assessments, notes about loyalty, predictions about behavior, recommendations about continued employment. As Dr. Chen worked deeper into the archives, patterns emerged. The surveillance had not been random. It had been targeted and purposeful. People in positions of trust who handled sensitive information or had access to private areas received the most thorough scrutiny. But the net had been cast wider than simple security concerns might justify. The journal provided context that the files themselves lacked. Its author, whose identity remained unknown, had maintained the log with bureaucratic precision. Entries described sources of information, conversations overheard, letters intercepted, reports from other staff members who apparently served as informants. The picture that emerged was of an intelligence network operating within the palace itself. Detective Thornton focused on a different question: where had the information gone? The files represented a collection on a significant scale, but collection implied use. Had these files influenced hiring decisions, dismissals? Had they been used to leverage behavior or extract cooperation? The journal suggested information had been passed upward to unnamed individuals referred to only as the principals. By the third day of investigation, the team had established a timeline. The surveillance operation appeared to have begun sometime in the early 1880, during Queen Victoria's reign. It had continued with varying intensity through the Edwardian period. The most recent dated files were from 1914, just as Europe descended into the First World War. Then the trail went cold. The chamber itself offered clues about its abandonment. A calendar on the wall was stopped at August 1914. Papers on the desk included a half-finished report dated August 3rd. Of that year, it appeared that whoever maintained this hidden archive had left quickly, perhaps expecting to return. They never had. Theories began to form. The outbreak of war would have transformed palace operations. Staff would have been redirected to wartime duties. Security priorities would have shifted dramatically. Perhaps in that chaos, the surveillance operation had been shut down, its existence known to only a handful of people who either died or took the secret with them. But the question of original authorization remained unanswered. Such an operation could not have existed without knowledge at the highest levels. Someone senior, someone with access to resources and authority, had established this hidden department. The journal's references to the principals suggested oversight from within the royal household itself, possibly from the monarch's senior advisors. Dr. Chen made a discovery on the fourth day that changed the investigation's direction. Among the files from 1903, she found a dossier that stood apart from the others. It documented not a palace employee, but a member of the aristocracy, Lord Edmund Hastings, a minor royal advisor who had served briefly under King Edward III. The file on Hastings was explosive. It detailed a financial scandal, evidence of bribery, and connections to individuals seeking to influence royal policy. Commercial advantage, but what made it remarkable was a notation in the margin added in a different hand. Matter resolved through informal channels. Subject removed from proximity to HM filed to. Remained sealed. Here was evidence that the surveillance operation had not merely collected information, but had acted upon it. Someone had used the intelligence gathered in this basement room to neutralize a threat to the crown, doing so quietly and without public scandal. The implications rippled outward. If Hastings had been handled this way, how many others had faced similar intervention? How many careers, reputations, and lives had been shaped by information gathered in secret and wielded without accountability? Inspector Thornon called for an expanded investigation. They needed to cross-reference the files against historical records of palace employment to trace what had become of the people documented in these dossiers. It was the only way to understand the full impact of what had operated beneath Buckingham Palace for more than 3 decades. As the first week of investigation drew to a close, the team had assembled a disturbing picture. The hidden chamber represented not an isolated incident, but a systematic program of domestic intelligence gathering that had operated at the heart of the British establishment. Its discovery posed questions that reached far beyond historical curiosity. Unveiling the past, the investigation expanded beyond the basement chamber into the vast archives of palace records. Dr. Chen and her team began the delicate work of comparing names from the hidden files against official employment records, correspondence, and court circulars. The process revealed discrepancies that told their own story. Thomas Garrett, for instance, his file from 1892 documented his role as an under-butler and noted his association with Irish nationalist sympathizers. The surveillance log recorded 3 months of monitoring his movements and correspondence. In the official palace records, Garrett's employment ended that same year with a notation of resigned for personal reasons. No pension, no letter of reference, simply erased from palace life. Margaret Ashworth's case proved even more troubling. Her file dated 1897 revealed she had worked as a lady's maid to one of Queen Victoria's ladies-in-waiting. The hidden archive contained intercepted letters she had written to a journalist describing conditions within the palace and minor scandals among the aristocratic visitors. The surveillance report recommended immediate dismissal without explanation. The official records showed she left service in November 1897. 6 months later, according to civil records, Dr. Chen obtained from the National Archives, Margaret Ashworth passed away in a workhouse at the age of 28. These were not isolated cases. Pattern after pattern emerged. People who appeared in the secret files with negative assessments found that palace careers terminated shortly afterward. Some disappeared from the historical record entirely. Others surfaced in circumstances of poverty or disgrace that seemed disproportionate to any documented offense. Inspector Thornton brought in a genealogist to trace descendants. If the surveillance operation had destroyed lives more than a century ago, those families deserved to know the truth. The genealogist, William Fraser, approached the task with the solemnity it deserved. Each name in the files represented not just historical data, but a human being whose life had been shaped by forces they never knew existed. The journal entries from the later period, 1910 through 1914, revealed an evolution in the operation scope. The surveillance had expanded beyond palace staff to include visitors, tradespeople, and even journalists who covered royal events. The files from this period contained surprisingly sophisticated analysis of political movements, social reforms, agendas, and potential threats to royal prestige. One entry from May 1913 documented surveillance of suffragette activists who had gained employment with aristocratic families connected to the court. The journal noted concern about ideological contamination and recommended enhanced screening of all staff with access to royal residences. The clinical language could not disguise the paranoia that seemed to intensify as British society modernized and challenged traditional hierarchies. Dr. Chen discovered something else as she worked through the chronological files. The handwriting in Journal changed not dramatically but discernibly. In 1895, the careful script that had characterized the early entries gave way to a slightly different style. The same transition appeared in file annotations. The surveillance operation had not been the work of a single individual, but an office that passed from one keeper to another. This realization led to a breakthrough. If position had been filled by different people over time, there might be records, might be payment ledgers or correspondence that reference the role, even obliquely. Palace employment records from Victorian era were extensive but often opaque, with budget line items that provided little detail about their purpose. The forensic accountant, David Morrison, found what they were looking for in a 1886 budget document. Buried among hundreds of entries for household expenses was a line item for Special Services Office of Household Security. The amount allocated was substantial £300 per year, equivalent to a senior servant's salary. The entry appeared in budgets through 1914, then vanished. Morrison traced the money. Payments had been authorized by the master of the household in each relevant year but required counter-signature from the keeper of the privy purse, the monarch's chief financial advisor. This was not some rogue operation. It had been officially funded through proper channels, which meant it had received royal approval at the highest administrative levels. The historical implications grew clearer. During Victoria's reign, the monarchy had faced genuine pressures. Republican movements, though never dominant, had challenged royal relevance. The press had become increasingly invasive. Labor movements questioned aristocratic privilege. In this context, intelligence capability focused on protecting royal interests would have seemed not paranoid, but prudent to those in power. Yet, prudence had clearly crossed into abuse. The files contained information that went far beyond security concerns. They documented personal relationships, political opinions, family scandals, and financial struggles. The surveillance operation had collected leverage, ammunition that could be deployed to ensure compliance and silence potential critics. Dr. Chen found a file that crystallized the moral dimensions of what they were uncovering. It documented a young woman named Claire Bennett, who had worked briefly as a housemaid in 1980. Her file noted that she was intelligent, attractive, and had caught the attention of a senior royal household member who had made unwanted advances. Rather than documenting the harassment she endured, the file framed her as a potential risk. The assessment noted she might cause embarrassment if she complained publicly. The recommendation was termination before any incident could occur. The file contained a final note dated 3 weeks after her dismissal. Subject has accepted financial consideration in exchange for a signed statement of voluntary departure and agreement of silence regarding all palace matters. Claire Bennett had been bought off, her experience erased to protect someone who had abused his position. Inspector Thornton read the file in silence. Then she closed it carefully and looked at her team. "This is not just historical injustice," she said. "This is evidence of a system designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. We need to document every case like this, every single one." The investigation had reached a turning point. What had begun as an effort to understand a strange historical artifact had become something larger. They were uncovering systematic abuse enabled by surveillance, by institutional power, and by the assumption that certain people and institutions existed beyond accountability. The royal response: the investigation could not remain secret indefinitely. After 2 weeks of intensive work, Inspector Thornton delivered a preliminary report to the palace administration. Its contents demanded decisions that only the highest authorities could make. Within 48 hours, she was summoned to a meeting that would determine how Britain confronted this uncomfortable chapter of royal history. The meeting took place not at Buckingham Palace, but at Windsor Castle, away from the building where the discovery had been made. Present were the private secretary to the sovereign, the Lord Chamberlain, legal counsel representing the Crown, and representatives from the Cabinet Office. The atmosphere was tense with the weight of consequences. Inspector Thornon presented her findings without embellishment. The facts spoke for themselves. A surveillance operation had functioned within the palace for at least 3 decades. It had been officially funded and therefore officially sanctioned. It had gathered information on hundreds of individuals, most of whom had no idea they were being monitored. It had been used to influence employment decisions, remove potential problems, and in at least some documented cases, silence people who might embarrass the Crown. The private secretary, Sir Michael Harrison, listened with an expression that revealed nothing. He had served the monarchy for 32 years through scandals and celebrations, always protecting the institution above all else. But this was different. This was not about individual mistakes, but systemic behavior embedded in the institution itself. "What is your recommendation, Inspector?" he asked when she finished. Thornton had prepared for this moment. "Full disclosure," she said, "a public acknowledgement of what existed, an investigation into its impacts and, where possible, accountability to the descendants of those affected." Anything less invites comparison to the very behavior this operation represented, hiding truth to protect power. The room fell silent. Legal counsel spoke first, outlining risks. Disclosure could trigger lawsuits, damage to the monarchy's reputation, and fuel Republican sentiment. There were arguments for keeping the discovery classified, for handling it as an internal matter that the public need not know about, but Sir Michael surprised them all. The monarchy has survived by adapting to changing expectations. He said, "We cannot preach transparency and accountability while hiding evidence of past abuses. If this becomes public through a leak, we lose all ability to shape the narrative responsibly. We must move first." The decision was made pending final approval from the sovereign. The discovery would be announced publicly within 1 week. A full historical investigation would be commissioned. Records would be open to accredited researchers. And most significantly, a victims fund would be established to provide redress where appropriate to descendants of people who could be proven to have suffered harm. Back at Buckingham Palace, preparation began for what would be an unprecedented announcement. Press officers drafted statements, historians prepared briefing materials, legal teams reviewed every word for potential liability. The palace had managed many crises, but none quite like this. A self-inflicted revelation about institutional wrongdoing for more than a century past. Dr. Chen and her team intensified their work. They had 1 week to prepare a summary comprehensive enough to support public disclosure, but clear enough for general understanding. The files numbered in the thousands. They focused on representative cases that illustrated both the scope and the impact of the surveillance operation. Not everyone within the palace supported the disclosure decision. Voices argued for minimization, for framing the discovery as a minor historical curiosity rather than something that demanded serious reckoning. Some suggested that historical context excused the behavior. Different times, different standards, different threats facing the monarchy. But Inspector Thornton insisted on clarity. If we explain away the abuse of power as simply a product of its era, she told Sir Michael in a private meeting, we deny justice to the people who suffered under it. Margaret Ashworth died in a workhouse because someone in this building decided her letters to a journalist made her expendable. The fact that it happened in 1897 does not make it less tragic or less wrong. The sovereign, after reviewing all materials, gave approval for disclosure. The monarch's statement would accompany the announcement, expressing regret for the suffering caused and commitment to confronting historical truth honestly. It was unprecedented, a reigning monarch acknowledging institutional failure from previous reigns. The announcement was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. Media outlets would receive embargoed briefings the evening before, with full materials provided to allow informed reporting. The palace would make available a senior spokesperson, Dr. Chin, and Inspector Thornton, for questions. Transcripts of selected files with personal information, redacted where necessary, would be published online. The night before the announcement, Dr. Chen walked through the basement corridor to the hidden chamber one final time. It remained sealed, preserved now as a historical site. She stood at the threshold and thought about all the lives documented in those files. People who had woken each day not knowing they were being watched, assessed, catalogued. People who had lost positions and prospects because someone with power had decided they represented a risk. She thought too about the people who had maintained the operation. They had believed they were protecting something important. They had probably seen themselves as guardians of stability and tradition. But they had wielded power without empathy, had treated human beings as problems to be managed rather than individuals with dignity and rights. The discovery had opened more than a hidden room. It had opened questions about the nature of institutional power, about the distance between public image and private reality, about accountability across time. These questions would not be answered by a single announcement or investigation. They would echo forward into ongoing debates about monarchy privilege and the responsibilities that come with inherited authority. The aftermath and implications. The announcement broke at 9:00 on Tuesday morning. Within minutes, it dominated news cycles globally. Secret Palace Spy Network uncovered, read one headline. Buckingham Palace reveals century-old surveillance program, declared another. The revelation that the monarchy had operated domestic intelligence gathering within its own walls generated immediate and intense reaction. The palace press conference began at 11:00. The room was packed with journalists from across the world. Sir Michael Harrison delivered the opening statement with careful precision. He acknowledged the discovery, outlined its basic parameters, and expressed the institution's commitment to understanding and learning from this chapter of history. Then Dr. Chen presented findings. She spoke about the scope of the surveillance, the people affected, and the documented impacts on lives and careers. She did so with scholarly restraint, but unmistakable moral clarity. These were not abstract historical facts, but stories of real people who had suffered real harm. The questions came immediately and intensely. How high did knowledge of the operation go? How many people were affected? Why had it been kept secret for so long? What would be done for descendants of those harmed? Inspector Thornton addressed the issue of accountability directly. We are investigating whether anyone currently alive bears legal responsibility, she said, but the greater accountability is institutional. Systems were created that enabled this surveillance and its consequences. Understanding those systems is crucial to ensuring nothing similar exists or emerges again. Public reaction fractured along predictable lines. Republican groups seized on the revelation as evidence that monarchy inherently tends toward abuse of power, that hereditary privilege corrupts oversight and enables institutional arrogance. Supporters of the monarchy praised the transparency of disclosure while arguing that judging the past by present standards was unfair. But something unexpected also emerged: widespread appreciation for the honesty of the revelation. Multiple commentators noted that institutions rarely volunteer uncomfortable truths about themselves. The decision to disclose rather than conceal, to investigate rather than dismiss, represented a form of accountability that transcended partisan debate about monarchy itself. The descendants began coming forward within days. William Fraser, the genealogist, had traced families connected to individuals documented in the files. Many had known nothing of their ancestors' connection to the palace or the circumstances that had ended those connections. Some reacted with anger, others with sadness. Many simply wanted acknowledgement that their family member had existed and that injustice had been done. Sarah Garrett, great-great-granddaughter of Thomas Garrett, the under-butler dismissed for Irish associations, spoke to journalists outside the palace gates. "My family always wondered what happened to him," she said. "There were stories that he'd worked at the palace, but left suddenly. He never spoke about it. Now we know why. Now we know he was driven out for political views that are utterly mainstream today. That matters. That means something." The Victims' Fund was established with an initial allocation of £2 million. It was intended to provide both financial redress where appropriate and funding for research into individual cases where families sought more information about their ancestors' experiences. The fund announcement generated its own controversy, with some arguing the amount was insufficient, and others questioning whether monetary compensation for century-old wrongs made any sense. Dr. Chen continued her archival work, now joined by a team of historians commissioned to produce a comprehensive report. They had 18 months to complete a full study of the surveillance operation, its origins, operations, impacts, and eventual dissolution. The report would become part of the official royal archives, available to researchers in perpetuity. The investigation revealed one final significant finding 3 months after the initial discovery. In a different section of the palace basement, workers located a second hidden space. This one contained personnel files, including information about some of the individuals who had staffed the surveillance operation itself. The records confirmed what had been suspected. The operation had been authorized at the highest levels of household administration and had operated with explicit approval from the keeper of the privy purse in each reign. More significantly, the personnel files revealed that the operation had been shut down not because someone recognized its moral problems, but because of practical necessity. When war erupted in 1914, palace resources had been redirected to support the war effort. The surveillance department, deemed non-essential in wartime, had simply ceased to function. Its files had been sealed away, intended for secure storage. Then, in the chaos of war and its aftermath, the existence of those files had been forgotten by everyone who might have ordered their destruction. The discovery had survived not because someone chose to preserve evidence, but because institutional memory had failed. This accident of history now provided a window into operations that would otherwise have remained unknown forever. As the first year after the discovery concluded, assessments began to appear. Historians debated what the surveillance operation revealed about the monarchy during the Victorian and Edwardian periods. Some argued it was evidence of institutional insecurity, a reaction to the modernizing forces that threatened traditional power structures. Others saw it as typical of intelligence practices across many governments and institutions of that era. Neither better nor worse than what occurred in other corridors of power, but public attention focused less on historical context than on contemporary implications. If such a system had existed in the past, what safeguards prevented similar abuses now? The palace responded by commissioning an independent review of all internal security and personnel practices. The review would examine whether appropriate oversight existed to prevent misuse of information or authority. The broader conversation extended beyond the palace walls to questions about institutional accountability generally. How should powerful organizations confront uncomfortable truths about their past? What responsibilities do they bear toward people harmed by previous iterations of the institution? When does historical acknowledgement become meaningful rather than merely performative? These questions remained live and contested as the second year after the discovery began. The comprehensive historical report neared completion. Several academic studies were underway. A documentary film was in production. The hidden chamber itself would eventually open to limited public viewing as part of special palace tours transformed from secret space to educational site. The monarchy continued as it had through centuries of change and challenge, but it continued with new awareness of how power, even well-intentioned power, could corrupt into surveillance and control. The discovery in the basement had forced confrontation with an uncomfortable truth. Institutions that present themselves as bastions of tradition and stability can harbor secrets that undermine their moral authority. Inspector Thornon, in one of her final interviews before moving on to other cases, reflected on the investigation's meaning. "We found files and documents," she said, "but what we really uncovered was a reminder that no institution exists above scrutiny, that power always requires accountability, and that truth, even uncomfortable truth, serves justice better than comfortable silence." The hidden chamber beneath Buckingham Palace now stood empty, its files transferred to climate-controlled archives. But the questions it raised continued to echo through British society, challenging assumptions about heritage, privilege, and the price of institutional loyalty. Outro, what began as a maintenance issue, revealed a hidden chapter of royal history that challenges our understanding of power and accountability. This discovery reminds us that truth, however disturbing, deserves light. What do you think about this story? Please share your thoughts in the comments. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe for more documentaries that explore the untold stories behind the world's most powerful institutions. History, as we have seen, is never truly buried. It simply waits to be discovered.